The moon appeared bright and clear behind a layer of high cirrostratus clouds that covered the sky, diffusing the moonlight and giving the moon an eerie halo. The minutes crept by, and nothing happened, until 7:43 p.m. Then a green flare appeared directly over the convoy and burst into a cluster of 8 green flares. One of the destroyers began firing with its main battery. Other ships also began firing, until the gunners realized they were firing at the anti-aircraft bursts of the destroyer. The guns all stopped, and the tension began again, and at 8 o'clock the radar operators saw 7 blips coming in from the south, 12 miles away. The spotter planes were still up there, overhead, dropping more flares. The destroyers began firing again, directed by radar. Captain Keeland moved the convoy away from the angle of attack to make it more difficult for the bombers. As the Japanese planes began to appear, the Americans saw that they were twin-engine Betty Mitsubishi bombers of the all-purpose type. These had been modified for torpedo work. This torpedo attack was badly coordinated. Good technique called for the formation to stick together until the moment of attack, and then for the planes to peel off and come in from several directions, in the hope of confusing the gunners and at least diluting the fire against any one plane. But these torpedo planes split up too soon and thus made individual targets for the gunners. The first plane appeared near the convoy 5 minutes after the 7 bombers had been sighted. At 8:06 p.m. the destroyer Drayton's lookouts spotted a plane coming in on her starboard beam until it was on a line with the transports. The Drayton's gunners opened fire but did not see any hits, and when the plane neared the transports, however, they opened fire, and the Japanese bomber turned on a wing and slid into the sea, erupting in a geyser of flame. 2 minutes later that Japanese bomber was followed by another. This one came in on the port bow of the Drayton. Her gunners opened fire, as did those of another destroyer nearby, and the plane crashed into the water. Another plane bored in, and another, and the guns of the ships were turned on them as they came. One by one the Japanese planes fell, each flaming into the sea and burning on the water, until 5 yellow flares had been added to the white ones. The fires spread across the water and continued to burn, and Convoy Commander Keeland moved away from them, for they silhouetted his ships. The attack reached its height 20 minutes after it began, and then suddenly it was over, and no damage had been suffered by the convoy. The officers of the destroyers reported hearing the sounds of torpedo propellers underwater and explosions that must have been torpedoes at the end of the run, but only the Crescent City's skipper noted any close explosions. He reported a heavy explosion at the height of the attack, but it did no damage, and he decided it must have been a spent torpedo going off nearby. Probably the ship most endangered was the President Adams. Her captain reported seeing a torpedo dropped 400 yards off her bow. It came up porpoising and then sank just 25 yards ahead of the ship's bow. The plane that had dropped the torpedo banked sharply to the right and passed directly over the President Adams. The plane had already been hit, and the gunners of the transport saw smoke trailing from its engines. They scored more hits, and the plane glided into the sea, where it caught fire and burned. 5 minutes after the attack ended, 2 PBY patrol bombers arrived from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. They were carrying flares, which they expected to drop some distance from the convoy, and thus to confuse the enemy torpedo bombers, but there was no need. The attack had ended for the night, a total failure for the Japanese and a most welcome success for the Americans, because for the first time a relatively lightly armoured convoy had come through a major attack without a scratch. The invasion of the Russell Islands was sheer anticlimax. Admiral Turner's ships and small craft and the escorting task force left Lunga Roads at Guadalcanal on the night of February 20, and steamed without incident. They reached the Russells by dawn. An advance force had already announced that the Japanese were gone, and they had not come back, so it was simply a matter of bringing the men and equipment ashore and setting up camp. In the next week, 9,000 men were brought to the islands to begin construction of an airbase and naval facilities for PT boats and other craft. The Japanese, meanwhile, were building up their forces at New Georgia and on Kolombangara, across Kula Gulf. Admiral Yamamoto didn't intend to let the Americans on Guadalcanal rest, and was already asking for more planes to reinvigorate his air attacks on Guadalcanal. From 4 bases located at Rabaul, The bombers and fighters could stage down to Little Buka Island at the northern tip of Bougainville, which housed an airbase. Another was located at Kahili, near Bouin, at the southern end of Bougainville, with a naval base and seaplane base. There was another airbase on Balale, and then one at Vila and another at Munda on New Georgia. The tables had been turned, however, in the naval sense. It was now the Japanese who were finding difficulties in running their supply missions to the southernmost bases through an American air and sea gauntlet. Vice Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, who had fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, was commander of Halsey's land-based air forces. His headquarters was located at Espiritu Santo, next to the Paliculo airfield. But the main airbase for Halsey's assault on the Japanese in the northern Solomons was Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. One fighter strip had been built during the heat of the campaign for the island and another a little later. Bomber strips were now added around Coley Point. Guadalcanal bristled with anti-aircraft guns, and the strips were always full of bombers and fighters. Just before the Russell's landing, Rear Admiral Charles P. Mason was moved up to Guadalcanal with a brand new job as Commander, Aircraft Solomons Islands. Halsey now had more than 300 aircraft on Guadalcanal, and for the first time since the campaign began, there seemed to be enough of everything. The Black Cat night fighters had made their appearance, and they would add a new dimension to the air war. Not nearly as many of the Japanese night fighters, the Geckos, ever got into action as did the Black Cats. In the air, the tables were almost completely turned on the Japanese, and at sea, 6 American task forces stood ready to accept any Japanese challenge. It was the Americans now who came by night to bombard Japanese airfields, as the Japanese had bombarded Henderson Field in the summer and fall of 1942. In February, planes from Admiral Fitch's force and others from General MacArthur's command bombed the Japanese airfields from Rabaul to Munda. But the Japanese were as determined to keep their fields in operation as the Americans had been in the bad days of the previous summer. The moment the bombers left the pitted airstrips, the troops were at work, filling them up with coral. The Americans destroyed the ground installations, so the Japanese moved underground. The American bombers didn't catch many planes on the ground at the southern bases, because the Japanese kept most of them back at Rabaul. But in February and March, there was no way of assessing the damage save through aerial reconnaissance, and that didn't show what was going on underground. The second Japanese resupply mission was sent down from Rabaul on February 19, the day before Admiral Turner's amphibious forces invaded the Russells. This time, lulled by their success on the first mission, the Japanese employed a transport, the Yokowaru Maru. She was escorted down to Kolombangara by No. 22 minesweeper and No. 25 subchaser, without incident. In the middle of the unloading, however, enemy planes interfered, when a number of fighters carried out a strafing attack, and in manoeuvring to escape them, the ships had about 10% of their supplies smashed up. There was no other damage. The Yokowaru Maru completed her unloading, and the minesweeper and subchaser took her back again safely to Rabaul. Then came the landings in the Russells, which the Japanese scout planes discovered immediately. That move created a whole new problem for the Army and the Navy cooperators. There were more meetings at Rabaul, and this time it was decided that the resupply system must again be changed. With the Allies so near, building naval and air bases in the Russells, such direct resupply must be abandoned. In the future, the supply ships would run in during the 10 days of the dark of the moon. If there were any questions by the Army, the Navy Scout Plane report of February 20 ought to answer them. The scout plane pilot counted 180 aircraft on the fields of Guadalcanal that day. The meaning was clear. The Americans could now attack Kolombangara and New Georgia from sea and air without much difficulty. The 80-mile gap between the tip of Guadalcanal and the south end of the Russells made that much difference. Once bridged, it opened the way for new nightmares for the Japanese defenders. If they were going to hold, the Navy told the Army would have to reinforce the troop contingents on New Georgia and Kolombangara. Reluctantly, the Army doubled the force to about 10,000 men. A third hurried resupply mission to Kolombangara was necessary to handle the rest of the supplies that had backed up. This mission was dispatched from Rabaul on February 27, just a week after the Americans took over the Russells. Again, a transport carried the supplies. She was the Kirikawa Maru, the same team, minesweeper number 22 and subchaser number 25, escorted her on the run south by night. Again, the nocturnal voyage was made without incident, but at about 4 o'clock the next afternoon, as she was unloading, a force of 18 fighters and a dozen dive bombers raided the anchorage. The 11th Air Fleet had assigned a protective air cover to this mission, in view of the changed circumstance of the enemy. A dozen Japanese fighters appeared, challenged the American force, and managed to keep the bombers away from the ships. So again the mission was a success, except that this time, on the return voyage, another set of American bombers found the Kirikawa Maru off the Shortlands and sank her. With the increasingly serious shortage of shipping, this loss gave the supply planners something to think about, particularly since in March the Americans were becoming decidedly more aggressive. Early in March, the American destroyers Fletcher, O'Bannon, Nicholas and Radford were assigned to bombard Munda Airfield on New Georgia. On the night of March 5, they came up the slot, past the Russells, just as the Japanese had come down so many times before. Then they turned west to pass Rendova and come in through Blanche Channel to hit the Munda Airfield. They fired 1,600 5-inch shells at the airfield that night and retired without seeing an enemy. It seemed to be a most successful mission. The trouble was that it did not put Munda Airfield out of commission. The next day the field was operating again as usual, but that night the Munda mission had a corollary. Rear Admiral A.S. Merrill was to take his task force of cruisers and destroyers into even more dangerous waters, further up the line, through Kula Gulf, to bombard Vila Airfield on Kolombangara. Merrill had the cruisers Montpelier, Cleveland and Denver, and 3 destroyers. The mission was timed to coincide with that of the 4 other United States destroyers. It also happened to coincide with a Japanese mission given the destroyers Minagumo and Murasame by Captain Tadao Tachi of the 2nd Destroyer Squadron to supply the Japanese garrison at Vila with food and ammunition. The Japanese ships left the destroyer base at the Shortlands shortly after dark, each carrying a full load of provisions. They were seen by an Australian coast watcher, but in the darkness he could not decide whether the ships were destroyers or cruisers, and he reported both possibilities to the American base at Guadalcanal. Admiral Merrill was steaming up the slot on the night of March 5 when a radio message from Guadalcanal warned him that the 2 enemy warships were at sea, moving into the area for which he was headed. A few minutes later he received word that the pilot of one of the 3 Black Cats, acting as his air cover, had spotted the enemy ships. They were heading for Vila. The Murasame and the Minagumo were quite unaware of the shadowing night fighters, and they steamed down past Vela Lavella Island and up through Blackett Strait. They arrived off Vila at 11:30 that night and transferred their cargoes to barges. Had they turned about and returned to the Shortlands by the same route, they would have missed the American ships, but the senior officer. Lieutenant Commander Tokuno of the Minagumo decided to make the faster run up through Kula Gulf to the Shortlands. That course took the Japanese straight towards the American force. In the night battles off Guadalcanal several months before, the Japanese usually had the best of it because they were carefully trained in night fighting techniques, and when they came down the slot in those early days, they were always looking for a fight. But this night it was the Americans who were looking for a fight, and because of the new techniques coming to the South Pacific, they were ready for it. They had been warned about the enemy's presence, and they had radar to plot their course and spot the enemy ships. The American radar picked up the Japanese destroyers very nicely, and the American cruisers suddenly opened fire. The 6th salvo struck 1 destroyer. The Americans said it was the Murasame, and that she was hit by the guns just before a torpedo fired by the destroyer. Waller also hit that ship. Some projectile must have hit the magazines of the destroyer in question. The Japanese said the Minagumo went down first, because she exploded and went down immediately. The 2nd destroyer, the Japanese said it was the Murasame. The Americans said it was the Minagumo, tried to escape to the northeast. Her captain still did not know what he faced. He had seen the enemy only as a few pinpoints of light, and he didn't know what sort of ships he faced or how many. He never had a chance to find out, because the radar shifted to his ship, and the cruisers began firing on him, and he had no chance even to fire back. The cruiser's 6-inch guns began to find the ship, and in 3 minutes she was dead in the water. One or more shells blew a hole in the plating at the engine room, and it began to fill, the ship started to sink, and the captain ordered the ship abandoned. Just then a pair of the ship's guns, set off by the American shells, began firing independently, and gave the Americans the impression that the destroyer was firing back at them. The surviving Japanese swam for it, as the American ships moved in and bombarded Vila airfield. From both destroyers, only 10 warrant officers and about 160 men survived to swim ashore and gain shelter with the Vila garrison. The Americans were long gone, having sped triumphantly back down the slot to Guadalcanal to report the sinking of a pair of Japanese cruisers. It was a signal victory for 2 reasons. It was accomplished with ease by the quick and accurate fire of the radar-controlled guns, and it was the first time the Waller had done something to rescue the dismal reputation of the American destroyer men in night fighting and particularly torpedo action. The Waller had fired 5 torpedoes, and one of them had done the job on 1 destroyer. The American Navy had started the Guadalcanal campaign at a considerable disadvantage, but in 6 months had caught up remarkably in every department, and the improvement in radar mechanics and techniques was from this point on to put the Japanese enemy at an enormous disadvantage for the rest of the war. February 1943 was marked by very little land fighting in either New Guinea or the Solomons. Japanese troops from Salamaua did try to capture the Australian airbase at WAU, but the Japanese force in the area was not powerful enough to overwhelm the defenders, so the Army Command decided to send reinforcements. A convoy of 3 ships made it safely from Rabaul to Wewak and landed supplies on February 19. The Allies had air patrols out, and they bombed and strafed Japanese installations and ships they could find at sea, but they didn't show any unusual air power at the time. Thus the Japanese had no real conception of the American air build-up that was occurring in the South Pacific and Southwest Pacific that month. General George C. Kenney's 5th Air Force was expanding, and that meant more fast P-38 twin-engine fighter planes, more medium B-25 and A-20 bombers, and more heavy B-17 and B-24 bombers. Until the last days of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese airmen had little respect for the American Army Air Forces. The Army pilots were flying the old P-400 fighter and the P-39. The latter was regarded by the Japanese Zero pilots as a pigeon, and there was nothing they liked better than to get into a fracas with a flock of those pigeons. The results were too often negative for the Americans, and as for the heavy bombers, they had a dismal record. The pilots had been trained in techniques designed for Europe's high-level bombing missions. But when they were brought to the Pacific and employed against shipping, the high-level bombing proved so fruitless that several Japanese convoy commanders boasted that they had absolutely no fear of a B-17 attack because the big bombers never hit anything they aimed at. From Tokyo that month, interspersed among the awkward explanations of the advance to the rear in the Solomons, were promises that the Japanese airmen and navy would soon be mopping up the enemy. But General Kenney was as much aware of the deficiencies of his air units as were the Japanese, and he had already taken steps to correct them. The Allied air forces in Papua had grown to number more than 200 bombers and 130 fighters. Normally, the version of the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber sent to the Pacific carried the bombardier in a plastic bubble in the nose of the plane to operate the Norden bombsight. But Kenney decided the planes would use a low-level approach and thus did not need that sort of precision. The bombardiers were taken out, and in each nose bubble 8 .50 caliber machine guns were substituted. Even the bombing techniques had undergone major alteration. The medium bombers were armed with 500-pound bombs fitted with delayed action fuses, so that the plane could come in low, bomb, and get away before the bomb exploded. No more high-level drops. From now on, the bombing against ships would be by skip bombing, coming in at low level and dropping the bombs so they struck the water in front of the target. The bombs would either explode close to the ship or skip into the sides. Either way, the effect was more like that of a torpedo. These techniques had been practiced by enough pilots against Japanese targets for the Americans to know that they worked, but the Japanese higher commands were serenely unaware of them or of the major build-up of American and Australian air forces in the area. There was a good deal of the self-delusion of arrogance within the Japanese military establishment, and that is the main reason that the extent or the portent of the defeat at Guadalcanal had not yet struck home. In February 1943, the first result of the new set of war plans evolved by the Imperial General Staff was a renewal of the drive to capture all of Papua. To this end, the Australian possession of the WAU airfield was even more of an obstacle to the orderly occupation of the Huon Gulf area, and Army and Navy commanders at Rabaul agreed that it must be removed. More troops were needed, and so a convoy was arranged to carry reinforcements from the Japanese Army's 51st Division to Leay. 8 transports and cargo ships were loaded with soldiers and provisions, including aviation gasoline in drums. These ships would be escorted by 8 destroyers, and the whole effort would be under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese land-based air forces, promised all the air support that would be needed. The convoy sailed at 11 o'clock on the night of February 28. On March 1, the convoy seemed protected by the squalls of a storm front as it moved at 7 knots down the Bismarck Sea toward northern New Guinea. Their major concern was submarine watch. Until the afternoon of March 1, the voyage was as successful as Admiral Kimura could wish. The ships moved under the cover of the storm, and no submarines appeared. But then the weather changed. The storm passed off into the Solomon Sea, and the cloud cover began to loosen. Suddenly, out of the clouds appeared a single B-24 bomber. The radio operator soon had sent word to General MacArthur's headquarters that a convoy of enemy merchant ships was at sea, protected by half a dozen destroyers. The B-24 shadowed them that afternoon and until dark, when it lost contact. Rabaul was as good as its word and sent air cover as soon as the news of the American plane was flashed. The next morning, March 2, the air cover was resumed, but so was the shadowing. The convoy was now nearing Vitiaz Strait, which runs between New Britain Island Rabaul and the Papuan Peninsula of New Guinea. The next morning a number of Allied bombers took off from fields on Papua. There were 12 B-17s and 17 B-24s, escorted by 16 P-38s of the 39th Fighter Squadron at Port Moresby. The weather over northern New Guinea was cloudy and full of thunderheads. The P-38s had a hard time keeping track of their bombers and lost them before they ever reached the vicinity of the convoy. They did spot a flight of 3 Japanese Army planes Oscars and shot down one of these, but that action had nothing to do with the convoy. The Army Command was sending small raiding flights over the Allied positions almost every day for harassment. As the convoy steamed along, out of the sky came 7 B-17s to launch an attack. 3 of them bombed from an altitude of 10,000 feet, the old technique. The destroyers and merchant ships immediately began stitching the sky with gunfire, as the Japanese historians put it later. At an altitude of about 6,000 feet, the B-17s levelled off and dropped their bombs. The transport Kyokusei Maru took direct hits on the No. 1 and No. 2 holds. Aboard this ship were troops of the 115th Infantry Regiment. The direct hits caused fires to break out in the ship, and 20 minutes later the troops abandoned her, and 50 minutes after that she sank. The transport Sayo Maru was in the right-hand column, and the Kenhu Maru was on the left. Both vessels took near misses that caused serious damage to the ships. The destroyer Asagumo rescued 819 men from the sunken transport. The destroyer Yukikaze took on the staff of the 51st Division, and these 2 destroyers left the convoy and put on full steam to deliver the passengers at Leay after dark. The destroyers turned about then to hurry back and join the convoy, and they were lucky not to reach it before the battle was joined. Thus far the attack had been no more than normal, and by Japanese standards a very lucky one for the Allies. But on the afternoon of March 2, a new element had entered the picture. From early afternoon, Admiral Kimura and the convoy commander were aware of constant shadowing of the main force by enemy aircraft, which in itself was unusual, and during the afternoon they were attacked by another 6 B-17s. These were driven off by friendly planes dispatched as air cover by Admiral Mikawa, but not before they had bombed the convoy, killing a number of men on each transport. After the attack, the shadowing from long distance continued, and as the convoy moved on, the Japanese air cover was intensified, and although another 4 planes attacked that afternoon, they were driven off without doing damage. As evening neared, the convoy was off Uinbari Island. That night, enemy planes dropped flares above the convoy, but no attack came. Admiral Kimura spent a watchful night, for the Japanese now expected enemy action at any time, but the really dangerous time, all agreed, would come when the convoy reached the narrow Dampier Strait. Once they negotiated that channel, they were virtually at Leay, and the voyage was completed. Travelling at 9 knots, the convoy expected to arrive at the destination shortly after daybreak. The convoy moved on and reached Winpoi Island, on the eastern side of Dampier Strait. They were more or less in Japanese territory from that point on. The activity began just before dawn, and the gloom of the pre-dawn sky was just lifting when the lookouts reported low-flying enemy scout planes around the convoy. When a look at the clearing sky showed that the weather was certain to be fine, Admiral Kimura prepared for trouble. With the dawn came the heavy air cover that Admiral Kimura had hoped for, 42 Zeros, Hamps and Oscars. The latter 2 types were also variants of the Zero fighter. From Rabaul circled the convoy at high altitude. On the basis of experience, they were in the right place to counter an American high-altitude bomber attack, but the Americans were becoming innovative. Early on the morning of March 3, the Allied planes began to take to the air. 16 P-38s of the 39th Squadron and 16 more from the 9th Squadron were assigned to escort the bombers in. When they reached a point about 30 miles from the convoy, they saw the high-altitude cover and moved to engage. Suddenly, those on the decks of the Japanese ships saw the sky full of planes. The lookouts counted 100 aircraft in the sky above them. The flight of B-17s that appeared at about 10 o'clock that morning came in at medium altitude. Following doctrine, the convoy commander kept his ships moving steadily on, ignoring the heavy bombers. But then, at mast height, in came dozens of A-20 and B-25 bombers and Beaufighters of the Royal Australian Air Force to bomb and strafe the convoy and the escorting destroyers. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese had adopted a defensive technique to counter torpedo planes. It called for the skipper to turn into or away from the attacking planes, thus presenting the narrowest possible target for torpedoes. This is what Admiral Kimura's skippers did that day. As the Allied air attack began, the activity began before dawn. The darkness was just beginning to lift when the lookouts of the protective destroyers reported seeing low-flying Allied patrol planes not far from the convoy. Admiral Kimura looked at the lightening sky. It was going to be a lovely day, clear as a bell, but worse luck. The Japanese waited, and at about 8 o'clock, Tokyo time, as compared to 10 o'clock in the time the United States forces used, the attackers arrived. They had formed up over the Papuan airfields early that morning, 2 squadrons of P-38s to escort 25 B-17s and 40 A-20s. These were the first attackers to appear. Then in came another group of B-25s, those specially equipped B-25s with the 8.50 caliber machine guns in the nose. The Japanese air command at Rabaul had made sure that the convoy was covered from before sunrise, but those 15 planes up above, flying high-altitude circles around the convoy, had been there a long time, and they were running short of gas. It was time for a change, and right on schedule up came their replacements from Rabaul. They arrived almost simultaneously with the first air attack on the convoy. Following the air doctrine evolved in dealing with B-17s, the Japanese fighters stayed high and prepared to attack. About 15 of the P-38s peeled off to keep them away from the bombers. Flying at medium altitude then, the Japanese planes were completely surprised when the A-20s and the B-25s appeared, so close to the deck that the slipstreams of the powerful engines churned up wakes in the sea. From Admiral Kimura's vantage point, the attack had the look of a torpedo plane strike, and the transports and warships took action accordingly, turning into the enemy planes, to minimize the size of the target they presented. It was just what the American bombers wanted, Down they roared over the ships, machine guns spitting. The ship's gunners along the sides of the vessels could not bring their weapons to bear. Only the bow and stern gunners could get fleeting shots at the attackers. The tracers and explosive shells of the machine guns started fires and killed many men aboard the ships, but this was only the beginning. After the first pass, the pilots turned and raced back, again at mast level, and this time they dropped their bombs as they came. The bombs struck the water, skipped, and smashed against the sides of the ships, tearing jagged holes, or exploded below the waterline with the effect of a torpedo. In half an hour it was all over. Every ship of the convoy was damaged, 7 transports and 6 destroyers, and the convoy was spread halfway over Huon Gulf. The convoy commander had hoped to land his troops at Leay that day, but the only ones who would get there would be those who could make it by small craft, and those troops carried in by the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze. The landing craft and barges were aboard the transports, but the speeding and dodging of the helmsmen to try to save the ships made it virtually impossible to put any of them over the side as long as the attack lasted. Then it was over. The Allied planes had run out of ammunition and bombs, and the air and the sea became suddenly quiet. Up above, even the skies were clear. The B-17s, having lost one of their number to Japanese fighters, had gone home. So had the A-20s and the B-25s, and the Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, which had come down lowest of all to strafe. 3 P-38s had gone down, and at least 5 Japanese fighters. One of the first ships of the convoy to sink was the destroyer Shirayuki, flagship of Admiral Kimura. The Tokitsukaze was also set afire and started sinking, and she carried members of the staff of the 18th Army. The next warship to feel the bite was the destroyer Arashio. As she floundered, dead in the water, her sister ship, the Asashio, came up to lend a hand. The American and Australian planes went back to their bases for gas and ammunition, and they would soon be on the attack again. The situation of the convoy as a military force was now hopeless. It was scattered and the ships were sunk or sinking. Only one of the transports hit that day had actually gone down, but several were burning, all were badly mauled, and there was no way that the force landing schedule could be met. What could be done was to move the troops into the landing craft and barges and get them ashore as swiftly as possible, and all efforts were turned to this end. It was apparent to the captain of the Oigawa Maru that his ship would never make it to Leay. She was badly holed and barely navigable, but at that moment there was nothing to do but wait. From the Japanese Navy point of view, too, at 8:30 that morning, the situation was nearly hopeless. It was obvious that the enemy had severely hurt the convoy. The destroyers had suffered nearly as badly as the transports. The Shirayuki, Admiral Masatomi Kimura's flagship, had been sunk. So had the Tokitsukaze and those staff officers of the 18th Army. The Arashio had become unnavigable, and the Asashio, standing alongside to conduct rescue operations, was attacked by the second wave of American bombers. When the second enemy attack came, the Oigawa Maru was sinking, and that raid finished her off. She went down fast, and to the surface came all sorts of flotsam, life rafts, cases of provisions and clothing, as well as a large number of floating bodies. Oddly, one group of about 20 bodies came up all together and drifted together in the current. The Oigawa Maru had sunk right in Dampier Strait, where the current was running at about 1.5 knots towards the south. At about 9 o'clock, the surviving destroyers moved in among the wreckage and began rescue operations. Back at Rabaul, it was recognized that the Leay landings were completely out of the question because of the destruction of the transports and thorough confusion of the escorting vessels. The Army Operations Command in the Yukikaze could no longer function. The Army Commander was landed at Finschhafen. At Rabaul, the 8th Area Army Command and the 18th Army Command called on the Southeast Area Naval Command for help, but at that time it was virtually impossible for anyone so far away to be helpful. Rabaul did radio truck, and 2 submarines, the I-26 and the I-17, were ordered to the scene, but the I-26 was on her way out to patrol along the east coast of Goshu Island. It would take more than a day to get to the scene. The I-17 was just about to return to Truk from patrol when she got the message. She turned around. Other than the dispatch of those 2 I-boats, the Navy felt it could do nothing. The high hopes of the Army were smashed. In the convoy, or what remained of it, at about 10:30 that morning came a report from Rabaul that a large force of enemy planes were heading toward the battle area. The 3 destroyers, Uranami, Shikinami and Asagumo, suspended rescue operations then and moved away from Dampier Strait, heading north around the end of Rongu Island. At 11:20 a.m., the men in the water and on the sinking ships were heartened to see Japanese fighters overhead. These were elements of the 12th and 14th Army fighter squadrons. At 10,000 feet, they gave air cover to the men in the water as the destroyers sped off to the north. But it was not long before the American planes arrived, and then a battle began at high altitude. Other American planes swooped down low to attack the remaining ships, boats and rafts in the water. From above, the flyers could see the enormous spread of flotsam, bodies, survivors clinging together, the sinking ships, and the destroyers struggling to escape. It overwhelmed the eye, one Japanese observer wrote. Soon Japanese Navy planes appeared on the scene as well, and added their strength to the fight. But their problem was the same as that of the previous day. The Japanese were at the disadvantage of being far from home base, which gave them a limited time to carry on the battle. Then, if they did not wish to land in the sea or on an outer island, they must speed back to Rabaul. This was one of the first of the aerial operations in which Army and Navy planes were called on under the new directives to cooperate. The degree of cooperation was not of the sort practiced by the Allies. Army and Navy units operated totally independently. Cooperation meant that the Navy planes showed up to help over what was essentially an Army area of operation. Several flights of Zeros came in, tangled with the Americans, and then went off again. But the American strength was far greater than the Japanese air commanders had expected it to be. At 1:15 in the afternoon, a whole new group of fighters and bombers appeared over Dampier Strait and began mixing it up with the Japanese defenders, attacking what was left of the forces on the sea. The Japanese airmen saw more B-17s, more A-20s, and a large number of P-40s, which did not have the range to join in the original battle at sea, but were admirably suited for attack and strafing operations under the circumstances that existed around Dampier Strait. They literally tore apart any remaining cohesion of the surviving Japanese units. Rafts, boats, and the listing sinking ships were worked over time and again. Japanese Navy planes from Rabaul tried to protect the men in the boats and in the water, but they were badly outnumbered. Half a dozen Japanese fighters went down that afternoon over Leay. A number of boats were making for the shore, and they were perfect targets for the P-40s. One of the P-40s began an attack on a landing barge loaded with troops from one of the transports. 7 Japanese fighters got on his tail, other United States fighters came in to help, and a dogfight began, and at least 2 of those 7 Japanese planes were shot down. The slaughter did not end until 4:30 p.m., when the Americans again were forced to return to their bases. The Shikinami and Uranami then turned back toward Rabaul with 2,700 survivors. They left behind the Yukikaze and Asagumo to deal with the remaining survivors in the water. As the night of March 3 came to Dampier Strait, so did the American PT boats. The Japanese Army and Navy planes had to head for home by the time the PT boats came out, 7 from the base at Tufi and 3 from Kona Cope. As darkness fell, they were moving into Kula Gulf. 2 of the boats hit debris from the day's battle and had to turn back. The other 8 boats went on, arriving off Leay shortly before 11 o'clock that night. 2 of them found the burning hulk of Oigawa Maru, already abandoned by her crew and passengers, and put 2 more torpedoes into her, and without ado she sank. The other PT boats scoured the water for ships but found none, and the only Japanese ships left in the Gulf that night were the sinking destroyers Arashio and Asashio. The others had picked up the survivors they could find and had headed back for Rabaul. The American PT boats then began searching for smaller craft, turning their 40mm, 37mm and 20mm guns on them. Those guns were of little use against a destroyer, except to sweep the decks, but against a life raft or boat they were devastating, and hundreds of Japanese soldiers died that night. Their craft were sunk and they were gunned to death as they tried to swim for the coast at Leay. It was not one of the more gallant nights for the United States Navy, but in this war there was little gallantry. The Japanese had established the nature of the war in the beginning, with their death marches in the Philippines, Malaya, and Indonesia, which had been designed to impress the local people with the superiority of the Japanese over the Westerners. Also at Guadalcanal, the Americans had learned a great deal about their enemy, particularly that surrender was disgraceful to him, and that a Japanese soldier would pretend to be wounded or to surrender, and then attack when the American guard was down. It did not take many such incidents to create a state of mind that could accept the shooting of unarmed men in the water, and Admiral Halsey's urgings to kill Japanese gave more or less official sanction to the slaughter. On March 4, the Japanese put an air umbrella over Kula Gulf, but the Americans penetrated, and at daybreak the bombers were up again. They bombed the hulks of both the Arashio and the Asashio and sank the latter. Late that afternoon, the B-25s were back, and they sank the crippled Arashio. That afternoon, Japanese patrol planes sent an urgent message to Rabaul. They had spotted a large group of survivors of one of the destroyers floating in the water 55 miles southeast of Rouen. But who was to save them? To dispatch more destroyers from Rabaul into the teeth of that Allied air attack was obviously foolhardy, and the Navy refused. They could try to put an air umbrella over the survivors, and they did. Early on the morning of March 5, Navy and Army planes flew over the area, dropping life preservers and circling to keep Allied aircraft away. That morning, the I-17 and I-26 arrived on the scene and began their rescue attempts. The I-17 surfaced and picked up 156 survivors, which was all she could carry. She submerged and returned to Truk to deliver them safe and sound. The I-26 also surfaced and started her rescue operations. She picked up 54 men and was getting ready to bring alongside 3 more landing craft with 100 survivors aboard, when out of nowhere appeared 2 American PT boats. They fired torpedoes at the surfaced submarine. The I-26 crash-dived and got away, but the PT boats moved in among the landing craft, strafing and dropping depth charges. The Japanese boats sank. The PT boats circled until no more heads showed in the water. The I-26 hung around the area for a while, but when she surfaced again, the water was empty. The PT boats had made further rescue attempts useless. That night she landed the survivors at Leay. She headed off on patrol and remained out until the 1st of May, and she returned to Truk to claim 2 7,000-ton Allied freighters sunk. The actual number of Japanese troops who made the shore was never known. Hundreds of survivors did swim to Leay, but they were unarmed and disorganized, and easy prey for Allied patrols and the unfriendly natives. Other survivors made land as far away as Guadalcanal, 700 miles away, only to run across American soldiers who were not taking prisoners. A handful survived to tell the tale. Back at Rabaul, it was the 10th of March before the shaken Army and Navy commands could properly assess the magnitude of the tragedy that had befallen the Leay convoy. Nearly 7,000 men had been aboard the 8 transports, including the crews. Of these, 1,200 had been landed at Leay by the destroyers. Another 2,700 survivors had been returned to Rabaul, but 3,000 men were missing and 4 destroyers were lost. It was a thorough shock to the Southeast Area Command, and it changed the nature of the war in the South Pacific. From this point on, Rabaul decided, all reinforcement would be done by barge. Never again would a big convoy of ships try to negotiate Kula Gulf. It had never been in Admiral Yamamoto's mind to yield the Solomons to the Americans. In the spring of 1943, he could not devote all his efforts to the recapture of the Southern Solomons because he was committed to supporting the Japanese army operations in New Guinea. He did, however, devote a good deal of effort to maintaining his position in the Central Solomons, extending as far south as New Georgia Island. The American move into the Russells made it more difficult, but even so, during the month of March, the Japanese carried out 7 resupply and reinforcement missions in the Central Solomons. The sinking of the destroyers Murasame and Minagumo on March 5 was a great setback to the Japanese Naval Command, for the belief persisted in Truk and Rabaul that one Japanese could lick 7 Americans. From the command's point of view, the mission was still something of a success since the ships had unloaded their supplies. Yamamoto was certainly not going to let the loss of 2 destroyers shake him. He would try again. The next Japanese supply mission to the south was dispatched just 3 days later, on March 8. The destroyers Asagumo, Yukikaze, and Nagatsuke carried 130 tons of ammunition and provisions to Kolombangara. Part of that would be ferried across to New Georgia for the defence build-up there, and they also brought 7 new anti-aircraft guns and their crews. Again 3 days later, March 11, 2 other destroyers, the Minazuki and the Ayazuki, were dispatched to resupply the seaplane base at Rakata Bay in the Shortlands with 46 tons of food and ammunition. Considering the fact that at the moment he's at Rabaul, preoccupied with force Leay in New Guinea by convoy, the resupply of the Solomons was going quite satisfactorily. The conventional American belief is that the use of destroyers indicated Japanese fear of using and losing merchant ships, but at this time that was not quite an accurate assessment. The real reason the Japanese used, as the Americans had at Guadalcanal, the short merchant shipping in the area. Some of were carried out by army transport, but after the Leay convoy disaster, the army was extremely short of transports in this area, and Imperial General Quarter turned a deaf ear to the request for more trouble. Sometimes there was trouble. On March 29, a 6-ship supply group was attacked by American planes, and 1 subchaser was sunk. Its captain and 20 men were killed. But during Tokyo Express continued to run regularly, although not without difficulties. On April 2, at Buin Anchorage, the destroyer Kazagumo was badly damaged by a mine. The skipper had been laid by American planes a few. The port had to be closed until the area was swept. The tempo of the Japanese resupply voyages stepped up during the last 10 days of April because of the 8th Air Army. Reinforcement to prepare for the attack everyone knew was coming sometime. Field hospitals, field artillery, and several battalions of infantry were all brought down to the Shortlands, to Munda, and to Kolombangara. The striking force of the 51st Division was brought back to Rakata Bay from Rabaul, where it had been sent with the fall of Guadalcanal. After the mining of the Kazagumo, when the end of the first week in May. And in April, Admiral Yamamoto took every advantage of the lull. In February and March, as he rebuilt the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul, Yamamoto made sure that Guadalcanal was bombed as often as could be managed. Bombings did not prevent the steady American build-up of the Guadalcanal base, as he had hoped to do, but they did keep the soldiers, sailors, and marines on their toes. For example, the first special construction arrived at Coley Point on March 21 to begin construction of new beach facilities. 2 days after the Seabees came, before they had gotten around to building permanent foxholes, they were bombed by the Japanese. The really serious bombing of Guadalcanal began again on April 1. It was the result of a war plan established in Tokyo by the General Staff. The Imperial Japanese Command had never wavered from its original the war in the southern regions of the new empire. The key to forward movement was the capture of the whole of New Guinea, and since this was the major island suitable for Japanese army tactics, the army was in charge. Since the army had its own troop transports, those 8 transports lost the reinforcement operation. Transports. Admiral Yamamoto's official responsibility to the army had been only to provide protection to get the army troops ashore and to protect the ships sent to supply them. Efforts by the army troops of Guadalcanal by the emergency there, the occupation and protection of smaller land masses was regarded as a Navy matter. Thus, theoretically, the Navy would defend the central and the Army would worry about New. After the debacle at Leay, 17th Army of Staff flew back to Tokyo to report
General Headquarters. One of the new difficulties perceived was the retraction of aircraft carriers and destroyers from the operational zone to Truk. Admiral Yamamoto was conserving his strength, still hoping for the one big battle that would cripple the United States Navy and bring the Allies to a conference on Japan's terms. After the Army argued that the Papua campaign had first priority, and that Admiral Yamamoto was to support that effort above all. Yamamoto argued the potential to knock out American bases before undertaking major naval operations. Since the Imperial General Staff was dominated by the Army, the outcome was predictable, but the Imperial General Staff did agree with Yamamoto to make their effort to American build-up in the Solomons, this with the understanding that the effort would also be directed against the New Guinea area, and that there would be no major military move to recapture the southern islands until New Guinea was secure. The first step in the new effort in the Solomons was Operation, a massive air campaign to knock out Allied air superiority in the Solomons and New Guinea. That decision was reached on March 25.
Day after day, aircraft came down the pipeline of interconnecting air bases that ran along the various islands from Tokyo to Rabaul. Yamamoto also brought to Rabaul carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuiko, Junyo, and Hiyo to send some of their planes in with the land-based aircraft of the 11th Air Fleet. The planes were concentrated on the airfields around Rabaul, and from that point they would take off, stop at the subsidiary fields for fuel, and then go on to attack the Allied bases. This divorce of the carrier planes from their carriers was necessary because of the enormous losses in pilots suffered by the 11th Air Fleet. It was a gamble. Carrier operations could go badly from that time on, if many of these highly trained pilots were lost in the next few months' air battles. The first of the new series of air battles occurred on April 1, when the Japanese sent a fighter sweep to Guadalcanal to knock out American fighter power. But the Allied coast watchers were on duty as usual, and as the waves of Japanese Zeros passed over Bougainville, Choiseul, Vella La Vella, and New Georgia, they reported the southern movement. As the planes neared Guadalcanal, they were picked up by American radar in plenty of time for the fighter units to scramble their planes and intercept. The Japanese sent down about 60 fighters, and the Americans put up about 40. Over the Russells, the Zeros met a mixture of Navy and Marine F-4Fs, F-4Us, and Army P-38s. In the melee that followed, 18 Zeros were destroyed, and 6 American fighters were lost. From that day, Japanese air and sea activity around Guadalcanal increased markedly. The Japanese resupplied Vila on April 1, using a convoy of supply-laden destroyers. The American heavy bombers from Southwest Pacific bases attacked that night, but didn't do much damage to the ships unloading off Blackett Strait.